I've already mentioned there are two things about the Greeks that were more like us in America. I'm not speaking as American. I want to say us. Now, I recall my high school history teacher, Mr. Woods by name. I don't even know his first name, but his last name was Woods. He was teaching a class where every one of us were white, and every one of us were Anglo-Saxon, and every one of us were American, and every one of us were Protestant if we had any religious convictions at all. But I realize here that does not apply here. I mean, a good percentage of you are not Americans, and most of you are not white. So when I say us, I have to remember, whoops, I mean Americans, folk. The Greeks were more like Americans and other peoples in that they had a form of democracy that early peoples did not. And also among them, they had people whom you would call religious skeptics. Persons who apparently had no religious beliefs, or persons who said if the gods exist, I don't know about them. Again, somewhat like us. Now, it is known that 95% of the Greeks believed in the gods. So I'm not trying to say they were all a bunch of religious skeptics, but they had religious skeptics among them. They also had more science than we do, and some of them actually tried to measure the size of the earth using scientific means of measuring. A lot of them knew the earth was round. Of course, the ancient Indians did that. And one of them even tried to measure the size of the sun. His computations was way off. He figured the sun was about 100 miles across. Again, far, far off. All right, so they did try to develop science, and they tried to use science, the scientific method, to explain the phenomena of the universe, more so than any people before them did. Now, Greece is very small and mountainous, and the mountains were rugged and steep, and they would separate one city-state from another. So basically you had one city-state here, the city-state with the surrounding countryside. Then over here you'd have another walled city with the surrounding countryside. Between them would be a large mountain. The mountains kept Greece from uniting, at least during the historical period. Now later on, a man named Philip of Macedon was able to unite them. But it was difficult to get an army from this city-state over top these mountains. The army would get tired and lose its equipment, or its soldiers would get sick with that thin air or whatever, and the cold air, then come down the other side of the mountain where the enemy was waiting for them. Well, the enemy had the advantage because they had not had to climb the mountain and lose their equipment and fall down and get skin up and bruised up. So the mountains kept the Greeks from uniting, at least during their historical period. However, we believe that at one point way back there, they were in fact united. The earliest civilization we know about are the Minoans. Far back, they lived in the area of the Aegean Sea. That's the area east of Greece, between Greece and Turkey. They used bronze, so they're considered Bronze Age. What we know about their language, it appears to have not been Greek. And since we cannot read what little writing they had, that's left, that is, most of what we know about them comes from archaeology. Now, folk, you might guess what I'm about to say. These were very, very early people, far back in time. They appear to have been wealthy, very prosperous. And they appear, as a lot of these ancient peoples, to where they didn't have very super wealthy people surrounded by a bunch of slums. Their wealth appears to have been fairly evenly distributed. Yes, evenly distributed.
What area?
This is the Minoan civilization located in the area around the Aegean Sea, which is the sea between Greece and Turkey. And a lot of the civilization appears to have been on the island of Crete. These were largely island people, more so than mainlanders. But we have found Aegean or Minoan artifacts on the mainland also. Because they lived on islands, they were a seagoing people. And a lot of the stuff that we find is stuff that came from other places. It's not located where they are, so it indicates that they had a lot of trade. Now, the Minoan civilization, such as it was, came to an abrupt, sudden end. We do not know why. It's like it was there one day, prosperous and wealthy, then it was gone. There is a possibility that a large tidal wave came in. We call them tsunamis. A tidal wave might have come over and washed away all those low-lying islands and left hardly anybody at all in their place. And then people living in higher elevations, higher the mountains and whatever came down and occupied what was left of it after the tidal wave came in. But we really do not know if there was a tidal wave. We actually do not know why the Minoan civilization came to an end. The Minoan civilization was followed by the Mycenaean. I've got to buy me a M-Y-C-E-N, yeah, okay, Mycenaean. The Mycenaean people were actually Greek. They came from Europe during a big migration that occurred around 1800 or 1900 BCE. And about this time, a lot of people from Northern Europe migrated southward. The Greeks, of course, migrated into Greece. The Latins migrated into Italy. And at the same time, the Medes and Persians migrated into what is today Iran or Persia. At the same time, the Aryans migrated to India. Something. And folks, it might have been an ice age, a climate cooling. And I have to say this because this is such a, pardon the expression, hot issue. Throughout history, the climate has simply seemingly gone up and down and up and down and up and down. It's just part of the natural cycle of things. And man has little to do with it. There have been ice ages, or many ice ages. The last miniature ice age, called Little Ice Age, occurred in the late 1600s, folks. So it hasn't been all that long ago. It hasn't been prehistoric. The ice age, the mini ice age, killed off a high percentage of the population in both Europe and China. And then the Black Death in the 1300s was caused by a cooling down of the climate. And it's believed that the Roman Empire fell that its fall was caused in part by a cooling of the climate. The hotter the climate gets, the more life there is, the better life is. And the colder the climate gets, plant life dies and animal life dies with it. And human life dies when plant and animal life dies. The best friend man has is global warming. The worst enemy mankind has ever had has been cooling. Again, cooling might have made these people move, but the Mycenaeans arrived in Greece. They were warlike, they were conquerors. Now, according to Homeric legends, they destroyed the city of Troy, which I'm about to talk about. But something I do want to mention, they wrote in a script called Linear B. Now that may mean nothing to you, but my first term paper in graduate school was about Linear B. That means with a Linear B, there obviously is a Linear A. Well, Linear A has not been deciphered, and we may never decipher it owing to the fact we just don't have enough documents. But with Linear B, we found a script, and apparently it was written. Now, linear means it's not written like the Hebrew language, like hieroglyphics, like uniform. It's written in a script. It's read from left to right, linear, a linear script, which was unusual up until that time. But during World War II, there were a lot of men who learned how to decode coded languages. I'll say this about World War II. The Germans and the Japanese used the same code throughout the war, and we got in on our code early in the war, and it greatly helped us win. And having been in the Army myself, I can tell you our government changes its code every day. We change the frequencies the radio operates on every day. We change the way we scramble our radios every day. Our enemy is going to have a hard time deciphering our codes because they change. But in those days, the Germans used the same code here, but the persons who studied how to decode codes got to work on deciphering the Linear B script, and they discovered, hey, this is Greek. And that was strange because nobody at the time had believed it. But they said, hey, the Linear B was written in Greek. Somehow or another, the Mycenaeans, like the Minoans, came to an abrupt, sudden end. And again, we don't know why. It might have given rise to stories of the tales of Atlantis, which I do hope to talk about before we leave Greece. Atlantis, you know, fell into the sea. All right. Then came a period where we don't have many writings. We call this the Dark Age. Now, we're running the term Dark Age again when talking about Europe. But when historians talk about a Dark Age, they mean a time period when we just don't have the records. Now, we know that this age was probably not dark, and that during this time, there were kings who came along, and young people grew up, and they had more children, and there might have been wars fought. We don't know much about it. So we call that the Dark Age. Then the Greeks abandoned their Linear B script for the Phoenician alphabet. Sometime during this period, they started using the Phoenician alphabet. That, in other words, the Greek letters that you see still on the sorority and fraternity houses, letter alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, so on and so forth. They started using the Phoenician alphabet, and then we can read their records again. And particularly the first records we have are records of who won the Olympic Games each year. Actually, they held the Olympics every 4 years. The Greeks were the starters of the Olympic Games. And from there, they began to write other history. But now, in the middle of this Dark Age, we run into a very interesting set of stories. A blind poet named Homer. And he wrote the Iliad and Odyssey. I ought to ask this. How many of you have run into the Iliad and Odyssey, maybe in your literature classes or... Okay, well, good. Nearly every hand in the room went up. All right, excellent, excellent. Essentially, the Iliad and Odyssey includes the story of the Trojan War, where that the high up person on the Greek, the high up woman in Greece was raped. Helen of Troy, and this led to the whole Greek city-states of Greece rising up and fighting a 10-year-long war against Troy. The war includes a whole lot of stuff now that we would today call miraculous. And it is not looked on by modern historians as serious history. Now, folk, I can't apologize enough for saying this. Every ancient people have stories in it that includes things that we today have a hard time believing. The Greeks considered the Iliad and Odyssey to be serious history. They had no doubt that this took place. Now, one of the heroes in the story was a man named Achilles. Achilles' mother was afraid that he was going to die in battle. I mean, it was a tragedy. I will talk more about the tragedy in Greek literature. The story is a tragedy. A tragedy is in literature is a story where the hero dies. Well, it was fated that Achilles was going to die in battle. So his mother went to the gods, and the gods said, well, dip him into the river Styx, and he'll be invulnerable. So the mother dipped him into the river Styx, all of it, except she held onto his heel, and his heel was not submerged, but the rest of it was submerged. So he grew up invulnerable. He went to battle, and nothing could hurt him. But one day he stepped on a sharp rock, and somebody noticed it bled, or his enemy, hey, his heel bled. So this enemy shot a poison arrow at his heel, and the poison arrow spread poison out his body and killed him. All right, how much of this can I believe? I have to reiterate, folks, the Greeks believed every word of it. Well, is there any proof that the story of the Trojan War took place? All right, the way the war ended. It ended when the Greeks supposedly gave up and realized they could not conquer Troy, so they built a big wooden horse. And they said, this is our gift to you, you the victors. And the Trojans then opened up the walls and rolled a horse inside. The horse was on wheels. And then they closed the gates. In the meantime, the Greek army marched away, but didn't march far. They marched out of sight, just over the hill, out of sight. and then stopped their march away from the city. In the meantime, this Trojan horse was filled with a bunch of Greek soldiers who, as soon as everybody in Troy was asleep and it was pitch dark, they got outside the horse, opened up the gates of the city. In the meantime, the buddies who were encamped out of sight came back to the city. When the gates opened, they entered, they burnt the city to the ground. And that was the end of Troy. Troy was never rebuilt. All right. Again, back to the question, how much of this can we believe? Well, in the late 1700s, we found the city of Troy, located where the Homeric legend said it would be. Troy is located on the west coast of what is today Turkey. And in true form, the last time Troy was destroyed, it was destroyed by fire, indicating that there might be something to the myths. All right, anybody have any comments? Here's what one of my high school classmates said about it. This same classmate is now a college professor up in Ohio. He said, oh yeah, there was a war between Troy and Greece, but after a while they stretched the story, and after a while gods became involved, and you can believe what you will. But these people had a different mindset towards spiritual matters than we do. They had a different mindset towards what we would call the supernatural than we do. Now, keep in mind too, when I was growing up, books like the Harry Potter series could hardly have been written. For many years, every story that featured magic, at the end of the story, always had a natural explanation. This ended when Dark Shadows came along. If any of you, there was a movie made about Dark Shadows recently. When Dark Shadows came along, where they had featured a whole lot of supernatural events that did not have a natural explanation. But for many years, this did not go on. Every miraculous event had some kind of natural explanation. Again, this was the environment I grew up with. Now, and among you younger folk, there might be less of that kind of crass materialism than there was then. The Odyssey continues where the Iliad left off. It's a story about a hero named Ulysses. And unlike the Iliad, parts of the Iliad, Ulysses actually got home eventually, even though his entire army was destroyed on the way. Ulysses was the king of a Greek city. And according to the story, Ulysses met all kinds of adventures, including some muses who could play music so well that you become completely captivated by it, or women, persons who could turn people into animals, and a story of a one-eyed Cyclops giant, and places. All right. Now, I read a book, about 30 years ago, where this author was trying to insist that the Odyssey was actually a true story, and he named the places. He said that what happened, a big, strong wind came up and blew the ship he was on all the way across the Atlantic, and he wound up in the Amazon River. And yes, if you know anything about the Odyssey, he met some women who were warriors, and he called them the Amazons, but he actually wound up in the Amazon River, but wound up recrossing the Atlantic on the way back. Yes?
I thought the main character in the Odyssey was Odysseus.
Ulysses, Odysseus. All right, the Greeks called him by one name. It's like the Greek gods.
Oh, so
And the Romans called him by another. Same person. Okay, yeah, same person.
Okay.
If you read about Jupiter, you're also reading about Zeus.
Okay.
Different names for different language barrier. And Ares is Mars. Yeah, good point. Good point. I'm glad about. Yeah, Odysseus. His name is Odysseus, also known as Ulysses. Again, folk, these stories are not looked on today by historians as being serious history. I have to repeat myself here. They were looked on in those days as being serious history by the persons who saw them. Can you give me your name?
Bryson.
Huh?
Bryson.
Jamal? Bryson. Okay. No. What's your name again? Tell me. I'm sorry. I'm hard of hearing.
Bryson, BLY7.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Now, these two poems come from the period of time we call the Dark Age. What they do tell us about the time period was it was a time period where the aristocratic social classes ruled. And these poems help strengthen the concept that the aristocrats should rule and aristocratic values should rule. It also tells us that these were warlike people who valued courage and honor. The Greek word was arete. I'm not going to write that down because it won't be on the test. But these were warlike people who valued arete above all else. Well, I mean, there's a place and time for courage and honor, but your authors will mention that what the Greeks did not value was cooperation, community, those kind of values. They didn't care about. It was just be brave, be courageous, fight well, and all of which have their place. But cooperation, taking care of the community, came later. All right, Greek city-states. This word I will write down, polis. From this we get words like metropolis, Minneapolis. My great-grandfather is buried in a town called Coraopolis. It has to do with a city and the surrounding countryside, because these cities needed a large surrounding countryside. Now the city itself was like a relatively, it might be a fairly large area. I don't want to say small. It might be a large area, but it'd be surrounded by walls. Then the countryside was where the people grew the food to feed the people inside the city. And in turn, the people inside the city provided services like blacksmithing and shoemaking and whatever, and government. But the polis, the city-state, and the surrounding countryside, and every Greek's life centered around his polis. Aristotle said a man belongs to polis. And now each of these local polises had a god or goddess. If you had lived in the city of Corinth, your goddess would be Aphrodite, or the Romans called her Venus. If you had lived in Sparta, your god would be Ares. The Romans called him Mars. If you lived in Athens, your goddess would be Athena. I believe the Romans called her Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. The Sparta, your god would have been the god of war, because the Spartans prided themselves on their ability to make war. The Greeks the Athenians prided themselves on their ability to have wisdom. The polis kept the Greeks from uniting because a person's loyalty was more to his local polis than he was to the whole country. Now, folk, we ran into this in American history during our own Civil War, when men like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson would choose to fight for the state of Virginia rather than fight for the United States, because the state was more important to them than the country. So when the Civil War broke out, a lot of Southerners fought for the South because they were Southern first. Now, not all of them. There was a Union general named Thomas who was a Southerner, General Thomas, and his loyalty was not understood. And there was David Farragut, who became America's first admiral. He was a Southerner, but his loyalty was, you're a Southerner, why are you in the South? Because I believe the Union ought to be preserved. But so there were a few who were different. But anyway, most of the Greeks were loyal to their own city-state more than they were loyal to being Greek. And this helped keep the Greeks from uniting, as well as their geography. Now, they learned how to fight with a fighting we'll call the hoplite phalanx. This varied a little bit from place to place and time to time. Now, basically, when you fight hoplites, the way they fought as a team. A typical hoplite, now I'm going to pretend for the moment that I'm right-handed. Actually, I'm left-handed. But now for the purposes, I have several of you left-handed. Let's try race. Okay. So anyway, I I cannot use this. It's not a dry marker. That's what
It's a dry erase marker.
it is a dry erase? Oh, yes it is. My apologies. All right. I'll give it back to you at the end of the class. Make sure you get it. All right. Anyway, I'm going to pretend like I'm right-handed. So I hold my sword in my right hand. With my left hand, I don't protect myself. With my left hand, it's out here protecting the man next to me. In turn, the man next to me, he's protecting me. What was so great about this way of fighting? You fought as a team. So if you were an enemy fighting against an organized bunch of hoplites, you did not fight individually. You fought the whole outfit as a unit.
So the word hoplite.
It basically means the word is only used in applying to Greeks. It's the Romans. The hoplite fighting only worked with relatively small armies because each soldier had to be able to hear the shout of his captain. Well, when the armies got really big, as in Roman times, they could not fight that way. But with the small armies that the Greeks had, they were able to fight shoulder to shoulder. Now, I want to digress a little bit. When you talk about the American Indians, we never call the American Indians soldiers. Why? What's the difference? The American Indians they had the will to fight. They had the courage to fight. But the American Indians never fought as a unit. Basically, if you'd been an American Indian and you went to war with another tribe, you'd look around and pick someone who was from the other tribe, who was about your size, and take him on. When one of you had finished off the other, you look around and pick on somebody else who was about your size and take him on. That was the way they fought. And when they came across a white man who fought as a unit, they lost badly. It wasn't just that they didn't have the guns, they didn't have the numbers. Also, their way of fighting was they could not stand up against a trained, organized army. Well, the Greeks were trained and organized, and they fought as a unit. Now again, this way of fighting had a serious weakness. If you could get around the flank, you could whip them. In other words, get around the side, because the Greeks were told to stand and face the front. And of course, they would line up sometimes 4 deep, in other words, behind. And if the man in front fell, the man behind him would stand up and take the place of the man who had fallen. And that way, the line remained supposedly unbroken. But if you could somehow get the line to break, and this happened more than once, you could whip them. Or if you could get around the flank. So what the Greeks would do, they'd pick their best men, and usually they're horsemen also. Now the mounted cavalry is becoming outdated, and for one thing, the land of Greece is not suited for a lot of horses, because the climate is such. If you don't have horses and cattle, they require a whole lot of space to graze in, which Greece didn't have. But the upper classes did have a few horses, and they would put the mounted horsemen on the flank and protect the flank. Particularly, again, since most men were right-handed, it seemed like if they put the shield on the left, the right flank was actually the most vulnerable, because it was told, no matter what happens, don't turn it around, because you can't turn around and protect your buddy. Just simply stay there and fight, and whatever you do, hold on to that shield, because it was considered a big disgrace to leave your shield behind. Now later on, that was to change. Some Greeks realized that, a Greek poet, Archelaus, said, yeah, sure, I left my shield behind. Well, why to leave behind? Because the thing was in my way. I can get another one. Basically, his side was lost. He had no chance to win. And the only way he could live was throw his shield down and run. Of course, the enemy was not going to throw their shields down, so they could never catch him. And at one time, that was considered cowardly, but later they realized, hey, this might be sometimes the only wise thing to do. But that's jumping around in the story a little bit. But the hoplite phalanx was their way of fighting, and this was the way they fought. And it had the good benefit of, it did keep down the number of casualties. They're less than they otherwise would have been. Because it was difficult to kill a man who was fighting unit to unit. But of course, eventually one side would win over the other. And anyway, the hoplites also was where that you could get the common men to fight. If a man could afford he had to furnish his own sword and shield. If a man could afford the sword and the shield, he could fight. And the Greeks had to give the ordinary people some rights in order to convince them to fight for them. And so this helped break down the old aristocratic order and lead the way to democracy. While all this was going on, keep in mind, Greece is not a fertile country, and a whole lot of their land is not easy to be farmed. So a lot of them, after the population got so big, they began to fan out. A lot of them moved towards what is today Turkey. They went across the Aegean Sea and settled in Turkey. Now this was to lead to a war with Persia later, so keep this in mind. A lot of them, of course, moved into Italy, and some of them moved as far away as southern France. But they began to fan out and spread out throughout the northern part of the Mediterranean, and in some cases even into the southern Mediterranean. And as they did so, they would keep in touch with the old mainland. Trade increased. Trade got to increase. But eventually what happened was new economics came into play, and the old order broke down. Particularly as new aristocrats came on the scene. Now this is something that I missed on a big test, so maybe that's why I want to emphasize. I missed on a big test when I was in graduate school. The new rich, sometimes called new man, who was not part of the established nobility, but basically had a man who started out in poverty, very poor like everybody else, but by the time he was in his middle age, he would amass a great amount of wealth, partly by being in the right place at the right time, or by seeing an opportunity and jumping on it. And a lot of your old aristocracy would lose their wealth. The landed gentry, the people who would inherit it. Well, after a while, the new wealthy began to break up the power of the old aristocracy, and they checked the influence. So the old aristocracy broke down, and this, of course, helped to bring on democracy. Now, another word we come into when we come to the Greeks is the word tyrant, and tyrant. Now, we always think the word tyrant as being a bad man. The word tyrant has a negative connotation, but in the Greeks it wasn't so much, they were not necessarily considered bad. The tyrants were men who would come, the word tyrant means a person who takes power by some means other than by a constitution. In other words, a tyrant was usually of low birth, who got to be wealthy, who saw the weakness of the man who was ruling, who would achieve power by a coup d'etat, in other words, by killing the person in power. I believe that's pronounced coup d'etat. In a coup. He killed a person who had been in power. Then once in power, he maintained his power by training an army of trained mercenaries. And the word mercenary means hired soldiers. And they built up their financial support by allying themselves with merchants and traders. The tyrants then got to power largely by money, and they stayed in power largely by money. Again, the several city-states went through periods of tyranny, but they were, with their money, they would construct marketplaces, temples, build walls. But like everything else, the tyrannies came to an end. Now, basically, the Greeks started out as a this government started out as a monarchy. The word monarch means a king who rules by divine right, but he's born into it. From there, they'd go to aristocracy. Now, the word aristocracy is used here means a rule by the people who are born into wealth, the born rate. The aristocracy would give rise to an oligarchy. These were people who acquired their wealth. So there was a slight difference. Then the oligarchy would eventually give way to a tyranny. These were people who took over by means of military and money.
What was the aristocracy?
Aristocracy, these are the people who, when the monarchy was put away, they would step in and they were born into their wealth. They were born rich. They were rich because their father had been rich, maybe their grandfather too, and great-grandfather. So they were the landed gentry, hereditary wealthy. Oligarchy, these were the new wealthy. Then came the tyrants. Oftentimes they were part of the oligarchy. But they had allied themselves with the merchants. Go ahead, okay, I'll be quiet. So, anybody?
What was the monarchy?
Monarchy, oh, that's a rule of one man by divine right. A king. The word monarchy means king. You have a king who rules by divine right, but eventually he's replaced by the aristocrats. They say, no, this king might be corrupt, so When you had a corrupt king, the aristocrats would take over, the oligarchs would take over there, then the tyrants, and then finally, at the bottom, at last, would come a democracy. That meant every man, and I must say man, because the Greeks never allowed the women to vote. Democracy meant that every man then in the polis had the right to vote. Now, when we talk about the philosophers, a lot of philosophers eventually gave democracy a bad name. In fact, democracy was to get a bad name and it was not to live down for 2,000 years. Owing to the fact that Greek democracies tended to eventually become dictatorships, or they tended to become tyrannies, so revert back to a tyranny. Again, the problem with democracies, well, there were several problems with it, but one of the problems was the common people found out that they could dip their hand in the public pot. You know, they could get the government to give them handouts and welfare. And eventually this would bankrupt the city-state. When the city-state became bankrupt and couldn't meet its payroll, the people would rebel. And they would put into power that's the word I'm trying to think of, demagogue. Basically, a demagogue was a dictator, some powerful ruler who would take over and end a democracy. Now, folk, in my lifetime, most of your Latin American countries that tried democracy wound up being taken over by a dictator. And your far eastern countries, whether it be Singapore, the Philippines, they started having a democracy and they wound up being taken over by a dictator. Democracy has often been associated with lawlessness, licentiousness, and public welfare. Is there any lesson for us to be learned from that? And deep, deep, deep indebtedness. All right, fast forward 2,500 years. What country in the world is making more news than other countries based on its being too deep in debt, so deep it can't pay it up? Anybody know? And it's not the United States, not yet. Greece. Yeah, Greece. They are doing as their ancestors did generations ago. Now, folk, about 3 years ago, the Swiss people were presented with a vote. Do we want to increase our vacation time, paid vacation, from 4 weeks to 6? You might think, hey, they'd be eager to vote for themselves 2 more weeks vacation. But the Swiss people, being the wise, industrious people I've always known they were, they voted it down by more than 60%. What's wrong with 6 weeks vacation? Well, while you're not working, somebody is paying for you to not work. So the Swiss voted it down. They now have the Greeks though set up such a welfare system that they have a retirement age of 51 years. Well, what's wrong with retiring at 50 years? If you live to be 75 and 80 and 85 and 90 like a lot of us do today, that means that all these years that you're not being productive, somebody else has to work for you. And the result is the whole system winds up crashing down because the government is expected to pay more than the government can collect from its people. It's called deficit spending, and the United States is not far behind. But again, these people wind up sometime making the same mistake. When we went to Korea and Vietnam, you'll see that these people in the 21st century are making the same moves that they made for more than 1,000, 2,000 years. Same thing with Greece. Anyway, democracy was to receive a bad name, and it was not to live down for a long time. Now, not all these city-states went through all these steps now. Some of them, now we'll talk about 2 city-states real quickly. In the case of Sparta, they never went through these steps. All right, the first one I'll talk about is Sparta, and then we'll talk about Athens. And those who are into it, now if you studied Greek history in more detail, there were far more city-states than just Sparta and Athens, but Sparta and Athens were the main ones. Sparta. All right. Early in its history, Sparta captured and controlled the city-state of Messenia. The Messenians then they put into slavery. So basically you had a situation where Sparta was the rulers. Well, Messenia did not take that sitting down and they revolted. Sparta called for help from other city-states and they put down the slave revolt. But they realized, hey, if we are going to protect ourselves from ever being taken over, we must teach our men how to fight. So Sparta became one big military camp where that a person was born a soldier, a man was born a soldier, and he remained a soldier all his life. From the time he was 6, his military training started at 6. All right. Sparta, the system was set up by a man named Lycurgus. Lycurgus. Now, in the middle of this word Lycurgus is the word cur, C-U-R, which means dog, and some people think that Lycurgus really was just a dog that they had used as a symbol. That is, the Constitution of Sparta was not really written by any man, but was written by a group of lawyers, you might say Spartan lawyers, who used the name of Lycurgus to symbolize that our symbol is going to be the dog, that they valued highly the dog. Be that as it may, Lycurgus may have actually existed. We don't know. But anyway, he was the Spartan lawgiver. So what was his laws? Well, one of the first laws was when you were born, your parents were allowed to keep you for a month. At the end of 1 month after you were born, you had to take your baby to a doctor, and the doctors would look you over. If the doctor decided you looked healthy, and this was true for the boys and the girls, you were allowed to grow up. If the doctors decided you didn't look healthy enough, your parents were to take you out into the forest and leave you to die. This practice of exposing babies was a very, very common practice in the ancient world. We'll talk about it again when we come to Romans. The Romans did the same thing also. A lot of ancient peoples got rid of babies this way that they felt like they could not afford, or babies that were weak and sickly. And folk, with all due respect to Spartans, you cannot tell after a month whether that baby is going to be strong, healthy, or weak and puny. You simply can't. Big babies will sometimes turn out puny, and small, tiny babies will sometimes turn out to be very large and strong. You simply cannot tell. But anyway, they would get rid of the babies. Then, when military training, the military training was so rough that a high percentage of Spartan boys died during the training. They undertook the training very. The training was very rigorous. In addition, even the women underwent training to desensitize them. Well, the women were expected to dance completely nude in front of the whole town. The whole purpose behind this was to desensitize the women, to make them willing to give up their husbands to the battlefield, to where when their husbands died, they would not mourn. And their book talks about a Spartan woman whose husband died. She, oh no, I'm not mourning for him. He did what he was supposed to do. And today's psychologists say this is the worst way in the world to handle grief, to pretend that you don't have it or pretend it doesn't exist. But this was the way that the women were expected to handle grief. And the women would tell the men as they left, either come back from the battle with your shield or come back on it. In other words, don't leave your shield behind. Either if you die in battle, they'll carry you on your shield, but don't leave your shield behind, which was considered a disgrace. Come back with your shield or on it, the women would say as the men left for battle. But their whole life was a big military training camp. Now, in Sparta's favor, I must say, they never had a coup. They never had a rebellion, except for slaves. Now, the slaves rebelled, but the Spartan men never did. But, oh yes, the Spartans told their people, don't visit among the other Greeks. You might become like them. Don't have any interest in art or music. And Aristotle will tell them later, you Spartans, you try your best to make only soldiers out of them. The result is you don't make good soldiers out of them, and you don't make good people out of them either, because there is such a thing as the arts and music and theater, all of which the Spartans discouraged their people from having. But the Spartan women and women were told, do not marry outside of Sparta. You are better than the other people. And folk, this, you may know what I'm about to say, is it was a huge genetic mistake, because inevitably in a gene pool there come mutations, that weaken a person, that's a gene pool, and then more mutations. If I could go back in time and advise, say, you Spartans need to send your men out to Spain, to Persia, even to far off India, and collect spouses from these countries, and that way you'll build up a super race of strong, strong warriors by diversifying your gene pool. But if you keep marrying only inside the gene pool, you're going to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and your population will decline, which is exactly what happened to them. They got weaker and weaker with each successive generation, and also the population declined. And while their population was declining, Messenia, their neighbors whom they were enslaving, their population was growing. Well, the time was to come when the Messenians outnumbered them 4, then 5, then 6 to 1. And eventually the Messenians no longer would be slaves to Spartans. But anyway, the Spartans did not have this kind of wisdom. They believed that and Hitler believed the same thing, by breeding the best with the best. I mean, hey, we tried this with horses. Have any of you heard of Lipizan, the type of strong, strong war horse? They only bred Lipizans with other Lipizans, and after a while, the Lipizans became weak. Anyway, hey, what we got to do is we got to breed these Lipizans with other horses to get the gene pool back strong again, to breed out some of these bad recessive genes. But the Spartans did not get to that point where they wised up. All right. Also, one thing that kept the Spartans' population from rising, Spartan men would marry maybe when they were 20 years old or 25, but they lived inside their barracks. And to see their wives, they had to sneak off, and most of the time the guards were guarded so well they couldn't sneak off. This guaranteed that the Spartan population is going to remain small. And later on, they made the mistake of telling Spartan couples that you must pay for your child's education. And most Spartan couples then had to practice birth control because they had no way of making money. I mean, let's face it, they were fed by the Messenians, but when it came to making money, they had no way of earning it. Therefore, they could not afford to have children. And of course, later you read where a huge earthquake struck, and it killed 25,000 Spartans and did not kill any Messenians to speak of. It only hit the city of Sparta. But Spartans did not live with their wives until after they turned 30. So basically, Sparta was a military camp, very organized, very controlled, very rigid. All right, we'll leave Sparta for a while and visit the city of Athens. We'll get back to Sparta later. All right, Athens was a lot like the United States. Now, I want to tell you something, folk. I grew up during what was called the Cold War. The Cold War was between the United States and Soviet Union, and it reminded me a lot of the war between Athens and Sparta. Eventually, Athens and Sparta went to war. Here's a disturbing part. I'm going to tell you right now. When the initial war broke out between Athens and Sparta, Sparta won. And I was thinking to myself, well, does this mean that when a war breaks out between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to win? I mean, we lived under this kind of fear. And having said that, the threat of war between the United States and Russia is just as strong today as it was then. But I'll leave that for the moment. Anyway, Athens, they allowed people to have difference of opinion, unlike Sparta. All right, oh yeah, I must say this in the long run. Today, Athens has at least 2 million people. Sparta in the mountains. Sparta itself is now nothing but a bunch of rocks, and some shepherds who graze their sheep and goats among the rocks. Nobody lives there. But there are 200 people who live in the mountains, and they claim to be descended from the Spartans, and they're really a sorry, pathetic lot of people. But they claim that they're descended from these Spartans. So in the short run, Sparta came out ahead. In the long run, Sparta lost miserably. Anyway, Athens started out as a monarchy, had a king, then it became an aristocracy, then it became an oligarchy, then a tyranny, and finally a democracy. Plato believed this cycle was part of the natural order of government, and he believed that democracy was the worst form of government you could have, that chaos came with democracy, and after a while people began to get tired of the chaos and they cried out, let's have order. And then into this scenario, some charismatic ruler named Donald Trump. No, scratch that. Some charismatic ruler would come on the scene who would say what the people wanted to hear, and everybody would just follow him, tooth and claw. But anyway, now, when the records start, we find Athens experiencing a period of economic hardship. And when an Athenian could not pay his debt, he would sell himself into slavery to satisfy his debt. Well, there were cries being made for, hey, let's cancel all debts or let's redistribute the land, because what had happened was what often happens throughout history. The rich wind up with all the land and the poor have none. A poor family will sometimes fall on hard times and have to sell the land, sometimes through no fault of their own. So after a while, all the land, practically all of it, was owned by the rich, and the rich became rich, super, super rich, and the poor became so poor they had to sell themselves to slavery, or in some cases, sell their sons and daughters into slavery to pay off their debts. Well, along came a call for, we need to cancel all debts, and this practice of canceling debts was common in the Near East. Now we need to take this land from the rich and redistribute it evenly among the poor. Into this scenario came Greece's first statesman, Solon. I've heard that name pronounced Solon. Solon. Solon became the Archon. That's the name of the office they had. Now again, this word Archon means he was elected to the office. Not that he was born into it, but he was chosen by a popular election. Now, okay. I'm going to insert something that's not in your book, but I have read that Solon went to Egypt, just like Socrates did, and like Plato did, and like Pythagoras did, and a lot of the Egyptian mathematicians and the Egyptian philosophers. Solon went to Egypt, and supposedly there in Egypt he learned from the Egyptian scholars, sometimes called Egyptian priests. He learned how that he could handle the problem, so he came back and did what he could to fix Athens. He outlawed the practice of using humans as collateral. He said no human may put himself up as collateral to enslave, and any human who's up as collateral must be released from slavery. He did that much. But he did not take the land from the rich and redistribute it among the poor. And for this I have to commend him. There have been many a case, including right south from the border of Mexico, where we had a dictator in Mexico once who took land from the rich and gave it to the poor. Korea did this. Some Chinese dynasties tried to do this. The result has always been a flop. Solon did not redistribute the land. Basically, I mean, there's a lot more detail that I could give, but I'm just going to state he outlawed the use of humans as collateral, did not redistribute land. His reforms, neither side liked him. The aristocrats didn't like him. The poor didn't like him. Neither side was happy. The poor wanted the land to be redistributed. The rich wanted a firm decision made as to just who was to be in charge. The aristocrats continued to fight over power. So Solon had a somewhat miserable time of it, but Solon retired. And once he retired, everybody said, hey, this man was a great statesman. He was like so many others. You could call him Moses, Abe Lincoln, for instance, who was Confucius, a man who was not honored till after he was gone. Then they realized, hey, we had a great statesman here, and he was actually right. He shouldn't have redistributed the land. He should have outlawed collateral. He should not have made a decision as to who was in power. Let that be done by other means. Solon retired from the government after going through a hard time. Nobody was happy. But later he came to be viewed as one of Athens' greatest statesmen. After he got gone, Athens settled in and experienced a period of economic prosperity that was to last for decades, and Solon got a lot of the credit. After Solon came Pisistratus. Pisistratus took over as a tyrant. He took advantage of political vacuum to take power, which was what Solon hadn't wanted. However, tyrant though he was a good tyrant. I mean, not all dictators have been lousy, not all of them have been bad. He was a good one. And under him, Athens prospered. And they looked on Solon as being a great statesman. After Pisistratus came Cleisthenes, and under him, Athens became more democratic than ever. Now, in the case of Cleisthenes, what you had during his time was that Athenians had divided themselves into tribes. So the tribes was, of course, based on ancestry. Well, the problem was some tribes were bigger than others. And Cleisthenes said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do to solve this problem. Because the people who came from small tribes felt like they were cheated and left out. So Cleisthenes said, I'm going to divide everybody into 10 tribes, not at all based on heredity. Basically, you pull out a lottery number out of a hat, you might say. Pull it out of a hat. And whichever tribe, number you get, that's your tribe. And there'll be 10 even tribes. So he organized all the citizens of 10 tribes, and the old tribal loyalties then were done away with. This actually benefited Athens in the long run. So everybody then was a member of a new tribe. And then he set up the Council of 500. In other words, as Athens got too big for everybody to become part of the government, so what we'll do, the Council of 500 is similar to our Congress today. He said that this Council of 500 will make our decisions for us. Now, later on, the Council of 500 was to wind up condemning Socrates to death, and it got a bad name. But nevertheless, the Council of 500 was a step toward democracy. Anybody could serve on the council. And this council would meet and just debate laws. Debate would swing votes, and the decisions that they made were final. Now, candidates who lost elections, now this may seem odd to us at first, but they were ostracized. You might think, hey, that word ostracized sounds like a bad term in today, but in those days, it really was almost a high honor to be ostracized. To be ostracized, you had to finish second best in the election. In other words, if there were 5 candidates in the election, usually only 2 would really come out powerful. But they realized after a while, and folks, I've seen this in church politics, for instance, where you have 2 persons of nearly equal power, but one of them gets slightly ahead. So this one takes office, but the other one is right there on the scene, ready to grab power at instant's notice. So the Greeks said, hey, a man can't function when his opponent, who has 48% of the votes on the last election, is so powerful. So the person who finished second, only the person who finished second would be told, you must leave the city and stay gone for 10 years. He was ostracized just so that the person who had won the election could function. Again, having grown up the way I did, I can understand why they would do this. It was designed to keep the most powerful opponent of the winner from exercising too much influence or bringing down the winner. Because if a person with 48% of the votes but didn't quite have a majority could easily bring the winner down, but it's just if the winner sneezed the wrong way. But by getting rid of the most powerful opponent, ostracized, then the Greeks were able to let the winner function for a time. Well, all right. Again, this clock is about 4 minutes fast. Now we have to interrupt the narrative of the development of Greek democracy because of something called the 2 Persian Wars. The Greeks living in Ionia, which is another name for Turkey. Turkey's been known as Asia Minor, the land of the Hatti or the Hittites, as well as Turkey. But anyway, the Ionians had fallen under the rule of the Persians. The Persian Empire had expanded and conquered Ionia. Well, the Greeks encouraged their brethren who had moved into Ionia to rebel, so they rebelled. Well, Darius, the king of Persia, said, all right, you Greeks, you want to help my subjects rebel? I'm going to get you next. So King Darius of Persia sent his army into the mainland Greece to conquer the Greeks. Well, The Greeks met the Persians at a place called Marathon, and this word has some Marathon. Marathon is only 26 miles from Athens. Now, the hero of the Battle of Marathon was a runner named Thucydides. Thucydides was the olive leaf winner because he outran all the other Greeks during the previous Olympics and achieved a well-deserved crown. Thucydides ran 150 miles to tell the other Greek city-states the Persians had arrived. Then, when a battle took place, no, he would not exempt himself from the battle. I mean, you'd think that the Greek king would say to him, hey, now you're too tired to fight, but he went ahead and he fought in the battle, which the Greeks won. Then he ran the 26 miles to Athens to tell the Athenians that they'd won. He got to the Athenian square and he was able to breathe out, victory is ours, and collapsed dead. From that day to this, runners have run a marathon, and the marathon is 26 miles long. Do any of our runners run faster than Thucydides? We don't know because Thucydides' run was not timed. It is likely, though, that today's runners might be faster than the ancient runners of Thucydides. Anyway, the Persians were finally defeated in battle. The myth of Persian invincibility was destroyed, and this was to lead to Persia's downfall later. Now, I want to say this. You can look into detail about the Battle of the Marathon. One of the reasons the Persians lost, the Greek troops were much better armed and trained than were the Persians, and also the Greek way of fighting of shoulder to shoulder, of breast to breast, was something the Persians were not familiar with. And again, this helped the Greeks to defeat the Persians. All right, we'll stop here at this time because the Persians came back a generation later and fought another war.